Hi guys, so this is part 23 of our book Posted. I'm on page 232. Miss Shears wasn't the only one with her hawk eyes peeled. That Monday afternoon, the entire teaching staff at Branton Middle School had gone on high alert, stripping notes off doors, off windows, fishing them out of recycling bins, gathering evidence. The big ham probably had a file full of the nastiest ones gathering in his office, ready to be dusted for fingerprints in order to discover who the culprits were. And to think that Dee Dee had started it all by welcoming me to the Dark Ages. It kind of felt like the Dark Ages, assassins sneaking down the halls in between periods to plant little poisonous notes on lockers. It wasn't a surprise then when the axe came down. On Tuesday morning in homeroom, right after the Pledge of Allegiance, the new commandment was delivered over the morning announcements in Mr. Whittingham's signature grunt. It has been brought to my attention by members of the faculty and several students that many of you have been using sticky notes to leave inappropriate and even insulting messages around the school. While I understand that for most of you this was intended to be fun, several faculty members have expressed concerns about messages they consider offensive. This kind of behavior undermines our mission here at Branton Middle School, which is to educate in a safe, nurturing, and inclusive environment. Therefore, until further notice, students are banned from posting such notes anywhere on school property. If any member of the faculty or staff sees a student doing so, the notes will be confiscated and a message will be sent home for that student's parents. He paused to let the weight of his pronouncement settle in. Now, here's Mrs. Kelly's 6th grade English class with a message about our upcoming canned food drive. I stopped listening and watched as more than one student tucked the sticky note they had been writing under their textbook or back into their backpack. This was probably the first time in Branton Middle School history that a principal had officially banned a school supply. In English, Mr. Sword took some responsibility. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, he began, one hand leaning on his desk. You heard Principal Whittingham this morning. I've seen some of the messages you all have been writing to each other. Most of them are incautious. Mr. Sword liked to toss around words that most of us didn't even know how to spell, probably to help us expand our vocabulary, but also maybe to show that he was still the smartest one in the room. But I've seen some that are very disappointing. Mr. Sword looked at me. At least he seemed to be looking at me. He was actually scanning the room, taking in everybody, but whenever a teacher gets to you, you sense a pause, whether there is one or not. I'm not sure why he fixated on me. The last note I'd even bothered to write was the one he told me to. He was obviously thinking the same thing. When I gave you guys that assignment last Friday, I was trying to teach you something, Mr. Sword continued. I thought if I forced you to share your words with the rest of the school, you'd discover a greater appreciation for them. I guess I was wrong. A snicker from behind me. Something funny, Mr. Kyle? Mr. Sword focused his attention on Noah sitting behind me, making it almost feel like he was staring at me again. No, Mr. Sword, it's just... I think some people are overreacting. We're just playing around. I don't think anybody meant anything by what they wrote. Several students murmured their agreement. Then Wolf spoke up again without raising his hand, though his voice barely notched above a whisper. What was that, Morgan? Mr. Sword prodded. I said it means something whether they mean it or not. You're absolutely right, Mr. Sword said. You can't know for certain what someone else is going to think or feel about what you've written. Some people are sensitive to things you might not be. You said it, not me, Jason Baker responded under his breath. Maybe some people are just completely insensitive jerks, Wolf murmured again. This time Jason leaned in and kicked the back of Wolf's chair. What did you say? Wolf turned around this time, face red, mouth working into a snarl. I said, maybe you should just shut your big, fat mouth for once. All right, gentlemen, Mr. Sword said, one hand raised in a call for peace. Jason ignored it. You got a problem, Morgan? Because you know how I feel when you look at me like that. Both Noah and Cameron snorted. Wolf's face only got redder. I put a hand on his arm. "Let it go," I whispered, but he jerked his arm away. He turned back to the front and stared straight ahead, slinking down in his seat. The class took a breath. Mr. Sword watched for 2 seconds, 3. He looked like he was just about to say something, but then he turned to write on the board. Behind us, Jason mouthed something to Noah Kyle, who whispered, "Totally." I had a pretty good guess at what Jason had said. Maybe Wolf did too. He reached into his backpack for a thin stack of notes, the same ones Principal Whittingham had just banned, and hurriedly scrawled something on the top one. Then he stood up, pushing the desk away from him with a nerve-grating screech. Mr. Sword turned, but he couldn't get to Wolf before Wolf slammed the note down on Jason's desk. We all arched up out of our seats. It was a more colorful version of the word butthole, and there was an arrow pointing directly to Jason. Wolf stood beside Jason's desk, shaking. I knew I should do something, say something. I'd never seen Wolf like this. Those fingers that danced over his piano keys, that painstakingly held tiny plastic pieces of miniature ships in place, were balled into white-knuckled fists. Jason started to stand, to get in a nudge, maybe, or just to get in Wolf's face, but Mr. Sword was there finally, one hand on each boy's shoulder, holding Jason down in his seat and pushing Wolf back a step. He snatched the note from Jason's desk and balled it up, then turned to Wolf. "Wait for me in the hallway." Wolf didn't move. He stood his ground, jaw clenched tight, refusing to speak. Mr. Sword spoke in an even voice, bending down to put his face right in front of Wolf's, eclipsing Jason's smug grin. "Hallway, Morgan, please." Wolf shook his head. Then he turned and grabbed his pack and bolted for the door. I tried to get his attention, but he wouldn't even look at me. He didn't look at anybody, not even Rose. Mr. Sword stood over Jason. "You and I will talk after class," he said sternly. "The rest of you start reading Act 3, Scene 2 of Julius Caesar, silently to yourselves. I don't want to hear a sound when I come back in this room. Understood?" Mr. Sword had never talked to us that way before, so we all just nodded. He raised a warning finger and then followed Wolf out into the hallway. We all followed directions, at least half of them anyways. There was no sound to be heard, even after he closed the door. We were all too busy trying to eavesdrop through the cinder block walls. I didn't see Wolf for the rest of that day. After the blow-up in English, he went home, maybe because he had to, maybe because he wanted to, maybe both. Dee Dee told me that he saw Wolf's mom in the big Ham's office before third period, hands flying, clearly upset. Principal Whittingham probably didn't know what he was getting into. Mrs. Thompson knew how to fight. In the end, she took Wolf home, and I made a mental note to call him as soon as I could and make sure everything was all right. I had never seen him go off like that. As the day dragged on, I didn't see near as many notes either, but I still saw enough to know that the war wasn't over. At lunch, it was just the three of us. We talked over what had happened and agreed that Jason Baker was indeed exactly what Wolf had called him. Then Rose told me stories about some of the jerks at her old school who made Jason look like Gandhi. She made Brenton Middle School sound like an oasis of brotherly love. "Wolf will be all right," she said as the lunch bell rang. But for the first time since I'd met her, Rose Holland didn't sound too sure. That afternoon, I rode the bus by myself again, passing the empty seat next to Sean Forsett. During the ride home, I watched 2 7th graders make tiny spitwads the size of BBs and then drop them from behind in Sean's thick curly hair, seeing how many they could get to stick before he noticed. I almost said something. They were up to 11 when the bus hit my stop. My mother met me at the door wearing an apron and a smile. "They gave me the afternoon off because I had too much overtime," she explained, her voice unnaturally bouncy. The house smelled like cinnamon and burning. "I've been baking." "That's great," I said. Then I grabbed the phone and went into my room to call Wolf. I sat for a minute trying to figure out what I'd say, but before I could dial, the doorbell rang. "Can you get that?" Mom yelled from the kitchen. "I'm elbow deep in bananas." I put down the phone and shuffled down the hall, thinking it might be Wolf. Maybe he'd biked over to see what he'd missed at school, or maybe he'd just come to talk. I opened the door halfway and peeked. Surprise! Rose stood in front of my house in her olive green army jacket, her hair in her face, hands tucked in her pockets, with her standing a step below. We were almost on even footing. Who is it? Mom yelled over the radio. I almost said a girl, which would have been a huge mistake, since instead I said the same thing Wolf said to his mother. Just a friend from school. Is it Bench? Mom called back. Mom used our nicknames. She was the only parent who did, except for mine. She never called me Frost, probably because Dad was the one who introduced us in the first place. Rose stepped up and leaned her head in the door. It's Rose Holland, Mrs. Voss, she shouted carelessly. I came to get your son's help with an assignment. We have English together. I heard the radio snap off and felt my stomach shrivel into a hard little knot. No doubt the sound of a girl's voice, even one as husky as Rose's, would come as a surprise to my mother. I considered dragging Rose with me outside, shutting the door behind us, but it was too late. Mom appeared in the hallway holding a towel. Oh, Rose, hi, she said. You could see her processors firing. She looked at Rose, at me, then back at Rose. She was ready to jump at all kinds of conclusions. I decided to stop her. We're writing an essay on Shakespeare, I said. Rose asked if I could look hers over. It seemed plausible enough. Your son's an excellent writer, Rose said, playing along, probably the best in the class. The only thing Rose had ever read of mine was the aphorism I stuck above the water fountain that day, and the one email I'd sent with its non-winking smiley face. My mother beamed, her forehead wrinkles smoothing. Oh, well, that's not a surprise. Did he tell you about the time he won the 5th grade poetry contest? Rose rolled her eyes. Are you kidding? It's all he ever talks about. I flashed her a what Sharpie have you been sniffing look. She ignored it. Your house is lovely, by the way. Well, thank you, Rose. Maybe my son will be polite enough to show you around before you two get busy. Everything stopped. Heartbeats, pumping lungs, the Earth's orbit around the sun. I let out an involuntary squeak, but Rose kept up her polite smile. My mother closed her eyes, face turning strawberry. Not that you're going to get busy. I meant before you have to get started on your work. She folded the dish towel in her hands over and over. Right, okay, back to my banana bread. She looked at me apologetically, then hurried back into the kitchen. I cleared my throat, scratched the back of my head. Well, okay then. Forget it. She seems cool, Rose said, no doubt seeing the crimson in my own cheeks. How could you not like someone who's making banana bread? Best food combo since chocolate met milk. Not necessarily when she makes it, I warned. Head over to Schoology.